Girl, I'm like, I'm going to have to call her because I'm not even going to think about what he's talking about.
All right, last time we went through this, I kind of gave you where we were going, the big picture items that we were going to cover. Today, I'm just going to cover how this links into the previous class, into Bandura. We're going to need some time for this activity. We're really going to spend some time. I know that looks like a lot, but we're really going to spend time on feedback and its role on reinforcement. So that's our big picture item for today. How are we going to use that? Because you're going to need some feedback on this. I didn't really give you a lot of information last time because we were looking at observational learning. Was that enough to look at those big picture items to be able to at least show somebody that if this was new and novel to them, what are the major steps that you would need to do to even make an attempt? That's all we were doing last time. Now we're actually going to try to produce an ember with it. But I'll show you how this fits in to the activity as we go through. Day 17, which was Monday, we looked at Bandura. We talked about the influence of information processing theory from Miller, and that Bandura just added motivation to it. But you'll notice there are some key elements inside the mediating process that are going to directly tie in to what we talk about today. So we've got attention and stimulus. Stimulus is huge. You're going to hear that repeated several times when we get to the behaviorist theories, when we get to Pavlov, Skinner, and we talk about the influence of what they were looking at. What were they trying to study? What did they believe was happening with learning? But Bandura knew the importance of feedback. So if you're going to practice something, doesn't matter if you're rehearsing explicit information and you're trying to get enough practice with that information so it sinks in, or something physical, you need to know if you're doing it right. Because if you, especially with a physical skill, if you perform it the wrong way, it takes way longer to unlearn that than it would have just to learn it the correct way. So we see this all the time in sport. Like if an athlete has especially foundational skills, like if we're looking at a wrestler, right, and we're looking at a takedown, they're shooting for singles, they're shooting for doubles, we want to make sure they get that foundational skill correct. Otherwise, we're going to spend a long time trying to unlearn what they have learned. So this feedback, when it comes to practice, is extremely important. And then reinforcement. That feedback is rewarding to some individuals depending on how you use it, right? And we'll talk about the different types of feedback and how you can, based on the type of feedback you use, you can really boost learning. Because we want it to be reinforcing. We don't want it to seem like punishment. And we're going to talk about the difference between reinforcement and punishment and how reinforcement has staying power. It's not saying that you never use punishment, but you want to use it sparingly because extinction occurs way faster with punishment than it does reinforcement, meaning the unlearning or them reverting back to the behavior you don't want. That happens way faster with punishment. All right, so let's get into today. We're going to talk about reinforcement is the main topic and how it's used in learning. Let's look at conditioning for just a sec. We mentioned it last time. We brought up Pavlov versus Skinner. And I want to look at the difference between those two and how stimulus was a major element of what they thought was going on in learning. If we wanted to break it up, both Pavlov and Skinner said, we can study the stimulus going in. What's happening internally is a black box. We don't know what that person's really thinking, but we can study the response. We can see the behavior on the other side to that stimulus. So both of them believe that. Pavlov took the involuntary route because he made an observation that this dog was starting to salivate when that bell would ring. It happened accidentally, right? You couldn't tell the dog what you wanted because we were trying to elicit an involuntary response. It happened accidentally, but he made that observation of that, and he picked up on how that learning was happening, how that habit was forming. So he breaks it up into before, during, and after. So you have an unconditioned response. The dog is going to salivate to food, which would be an unconditioned stimulus. You present any dog with food, and they're probably going to salivate. But then you had a neutral stimulus, a bell. If it's not paired with the food, it's never going to elicit a response, right? But what was happening is Pavlov's assistant was coming in, and on the door was a bell. The bell would ring, the dog would get fed. That happened enough that eventually the bell became a conditioned stimulus that elicited a conditioned response. It would start salivating at the bell alone. You didn't even have to bring food in. But that was involuntary. Skinner, instead of looking at involuntary, went to voluntary behaviors. And he looked at reinforcement. How do we use reinforcement to take an involuntary behavior and make it voluntary? So I love this matrices when it comes to explaining the difference between reinforcement and punishment. But let me talk about how Skinner used it first, and then we'll talk about the difference between those two, because it'll make more sense if you have that example. So Skinner took a rat, he put it in a box. At the bottom of that box was an electrical grid. On the side of that box was a lever. And you'll see some illustrations where it looks like a lever that the rat has to pull. It was a lever that the rat had to press because it was involuntary. So the shock would start, so they used like a timed interval. If the rat didn't push the lever, that's the behavior we wanted them to exhibit, that shock would start. And this sounds like punishment, but it's actually reinforcement, and I'll describe why in just a second. So the rat starts hopping around, right? It's been 2 minutes. The rat hasn't done what we want it to. It doesn't even know what we want it to do. And it starts hopping around, and it bumps up against that lever. The shock stops. We have removed something the rat doesn't like to get them to do something we want them to do. That's reinforcement, because we're trying to get them to increase or maintain a behavior. But it did it accidentally, so it doesn't pick up on it right away. It takes several times, and eventually the rat picks up on, hey, at this certain amount of time, if I don't press that lever, this shock is going to start. Well, rat goes over and pushes the lever, and the shock never starts. It stops it. But if the rat presses it early enough, it'll get fed something desired. They're doing the behavior we want, so behavior is going up. They're doing what we want, they get fed. So it starts to press that, but it has to do it in a certain period of time. But eventually, it picks up on that, and it exhibits that voluntary behavior. So we took an involuntary behavior, but the rat picked up on what we wanted them to do, and it became a voluntary behavior. With humans, you can skip the involuntary step, because we can tell them what we want them to do through feedback. We can't do that with animals. So we can go straight to voluntary behavior and try to use reinforcement to increase the behavior we want. Now let's look at this chart real quick. I'm going to start right here. Always start with behavior. If you're like, I don't know what I'm using. I don't know the difference between reinforcement and punishment. Are you trying to increase a behavior or maintain it? Reinforcement. Are you trying to decrease a behavior? Punishment. That's the easiest way to decide. Don't even get into the difference between positive and negative. That's where the stimulus comes in. Start with behavior. I have a child, I don't want them to do something, I don't want to use punishment. What do I want them to increase? What behavior would I like to see? What's the desired behavior? What do I want to increase? Then I'm using reinforcement. If I'm trying to stop them from doing something, may have to use punishment. But you've got to use it sparingly. All right, now let's go into the difference between positive and negative reinforcement, because this is where the stimulus comes in. Don't let the positive and negative sign confuse you, because it confuses a lot of people. Positive reinforcement. The rat got fed something desired to increase the behavior of pressing the lever. Positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, the electrical shock. I said that sounds like punishment, but we're removing something adverse because they did something we wanted them to do. Negative reinforcement. Now let's look at punishment. Negative punishment, you've got something desired that you like. Maybe you like your phone, maybe you like video games, and a parent takes that away from a child. Something desired, you just took it away from me to stop me from doing something. I did something you didn't want me to do. Or, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, probably got spankings. Something adverse was added, a stimulus was added that you didn't want to stop you from doing something. Maybe you went out and broke a window, or you got bad grades, and you got a spanking, or snuck out of the house. That is positive punishment. I'm adding something. But you got to be real careful on how often you use it, because it's something people don't want, and we're trying to stop them from doing something. It's way easier to get them to do a desired behavior than it is to stop somebody from doing something.
So what if you have reoccurring behavior, like it keep occurring? So
You may have to switch
okay.
to what you're using. So you're like, hey, this is not working. Let's switch to something else. Maybe I'm using positive reinforcement, that's not working. Maybe I'll start using negative reinforcement. Maybe that's not working. Then we may have to go to punishment. You can't say I'm always going to use reinforcement, because like you're saying, it may not work. You can read all the textbooks in the world. You can see all the experts in the field. Some of those experts have the worst kids that I've ever seen, right? You've got to use common sense. Go old school. What's working? Stick with that. All right, now let's look at feedback in terms of performance at some sort of task, because that's what we're going to use. And I want you to reflect on how I use feedback today when y'all practice this skill, and is it reinforcing to you? What type of feedback do you notice that I'm using when we get in our groups and try to make this? So let's cover feedback real quick. You got positive feedback. If I just say good job, you don't even know what you did well. It may not, it could be just as useless as negative feedback, because I didn't pair it with anything, right? I didn't tell you anything. There was nothing constructive, nothing informative. Negative feedback. You're out there, you run a route, your coach is like, you stupid, and start screaming at you, right? But they didn't tell you what you did wrong. Not necessarily useful. Not saying that you can't use it, but you need to pair it with something. That's where constructive feedback comes in. I like the sandwich method. And it can be paired with positive, negative, or motivational. Doesn't matter. So I can say, hey, great job. This is what you did well. Overall, great job. That would be positive. Sandwiching the constructive piece between two positives. Or I could go the motivational route, where I say, hey, great job. This is what you did well. This is what you need to improve on. But overall, you're in the right direction. All right? Motivational. I'm giving a little bit more than just what you did well. I'm giving something that you can change and make it better. And we're going to have the same thing here. I want you to, is my feedback reinforcing what we're trying, the desired behavior of you trying to at least attempt an ember? Does it get you there? Is it informative enough so that you can correct any mistakes that you make on something that's new and novel? This is just an assessment of feedback and reinforcement and how the two are paired. We good? All right, let's see. Leave your sign-in sheets here. Make sure you got them. I'll meet y'all over at the couches, and I'll do a demo before y'all get started, and then I'll walk around and provide feedback, and we'll see if we can pull this off. This one's going to be tough. This one's physical. Larger groups will do better. Teamwork will help you pull this one off.
Motivation.
Motivation will help you pull that off. I'll meet you at the couches. Just leave your sheets on your table and I'll grab them.